The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It was a raw, living thing tearing through the high passes of the Montana Territory, and it wanted to peel the flesh from her bones. Clara's lungs burned with every breath, the air so cold it felt like swallowing glass. Ice crusted her eyelashes, and her borrowed woolen shawl was a poor defense against the blizzard. She had stopped feeling her feet miles back. Now they were just dead weights, things she had to lift in place, one after the other. In snow that was sometimes knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, she was no longer following a trail. There was no trail. There was only white, above, below, and all around. The world had vanished, leaving only the cold and the wind. She clutched the swell of her belly, a hard, round burden beneath the layers of wet wool. This was the only thing that mattered, the small, secret life that had cost her everything. She stumbled, her leg plunging into a hidden drift. She tried to pull it free, but the effort was too much. The last of her strength, the final ember of defiance that had carried her hundreds of miles from a life she could not bear, finally went out. She fell sideways into the snow, the world tilting into a soft, dizzying white. Her body was failing. She knew it. A strange, painless peace began to settle over her. It would be so easy to sleep. "I'm pregnant," she whispered to the storm. It was not a plea, it was a confession, a final statement of fact before the white consumed her. Her eyes drifted shut. He saw the color first, a patch of dark calico, nearly buried. 100 yards off the game trail he followed. Eli Cutter reined in his mule. Old Saul, who snorted and shook his head, heavy ice clinging to his muzzle. Eli's first thought was not pity. It was annoyance, trouble. This was the world intruding, the very world he had climbed 10,000 feet to escape. He was a man who lived by the trap line and the rifle, a man who had not spoken to another soul in 6 months. He liked it that way. He sat there for a long minute, the wind whipping his beard, letting the cold seep into his decision. It could be a trick. It could be a body, already frozen solid. It was none of his business. He started to nudge Saul forward, back toward the cabin, back toward the warmth of his stove and the smell of drying pine. He stopped. Damnation. He slid off the mule, his snowshoes sinking deep. He moved with a grudging efficiency, his tall frame cutting through the wind. He reached the mound of calico and brushed the snow away. A woman, young. Her face was a pale, bluish white, her lips cracked and bloodless. She was breathing, but barely. A shallow, rattling flutter in her chest. He saw the swell of her stomach, and the annoyance hardened into something colder. A woman, and pregnant. The world didn't just intrude, it sent its worst complications. He stood over her, his mind warring. Leave her. It was the mountain's way. Survival was a grim tally, and she had lost, but his hands were already moving, untying the thick buffalo coat from the back of his saddle. He had skinned the beast himself. It was heavy, stiff with cold, but it held the memory of warmth. He lifted her. She was lighter than a starved deer, a small, frozen bird. He wrapped her in the coat, the smell of animal musk and wood smoke enveloping her. Getting her onto the mule was a misery. He had to haul her dead weight up, settling her across the saddle in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. She did not stir. He mounted behind her, his arms caging her against his body. He nudged old Saul into a weary walk. The cabin was still 2 miles off, and the storm was getting worse. He held the frozen woman, his jaw tight, already regretting the choice. He was bringing the world home. Clara woke slowly, dragged up from a deep, dark place. The first thing she felt was pain, a dull, heavy ache in her hands and feet, a sharp stinging in her cheeks. The second thing she felt was warmth. It was a thick, dry heat, pressing on her from all sides. She smelled wood smoke, dried herbs, and the savory scent of broth. She heard the crackle of a fire and the steady slice of a knife against a whetstone. Her eyes opened. The light was dim. She was in a small room, a cabin, the walls made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. She lay on a narrow cot, buried under a mountain of fur pelts and thick wool blankets. A fire blazed in a stone hearth nearby, casting restless shadows, and in the corner, a man sat on a stool, his back to her. He was large, filling the small space. He wore a flannel shirt, threadbare at the elbows, and suspenders over dark wool trousers. He was sharpening a long skinning knife. Clara's heart seized. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness slammed her back down. She was weak, weaker than a newborn kitten. The movement made a small sound, the rustle of the furs. The man stopped his work. The scrape of steel on stone ceased. He did not turn around for a long moment. Then, slowly, he set the knife and stone on the floor and rose. He was tall, and seemed to fill the cabin with a dark, quiet energy. He turned, and she saw his face. It was a hard face, carved from the same granite as the mountains outside. A thick beard, untrimmed, covered his jaw, but it could not hide the grim set of his mouth. His eyes, in the firelight, were the color of a winter sky. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He was not glad to see her awake. He was not anything. Who are you?" Her voice was a dry croak. He walked to the hearth, picked up a tin cup from the stones, and dipped it into a pot hanging over the fire. He walked to her cot. He did not offer the cup. He just stood there, holding it. "You were near frozen," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel. "On the North Ridge. 2 days back. 2 days. She had been here for 2 days. He held out the cup. "Drink." She stared at him, suspicion warring with a desperate thirst. This was a stranger, a mountain man, the kind of man she had been warned about, living alone, far from the law. But he had not left her to die. He had brought her here. He had wrapped her in these warm furs. Her hands were bandaged, thick strips of clean cloth wrapped around her fingers. She tried to lift them, but they felt like clumsy blocks of wood. "My hands," she whispered, the panic rising again. "Frostbite," he said, his tone flat. "Your feet, too, and your face. You'll keep 'em. I figure, but they'll hurt." He pushed the cup closer. "Drink the broth." She could not lift her hands to take it. A flush of shame warmed her, to be this helpless. He watched her struggle for a second, his face impassive. Then, with a sigh that sounded like impatience, he sat on the edge of the cot. He slipped one arm under her shoulders, lifting her just enough. The strength in his arm was effortless. He brought the cup to her lips. "Drink," he commanded again. The broth was hot, salty, and rich with game. It scalded her throat, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was life. She drank it all, greedily, her eyes never leaving his face. He watched the fire, not her. When the cup was empty, he lowered her back down and stood up, moving back to the center of the room. "My things," she said, her mind starting to clear. "I had a satchel. It's gone," he said, stirring the pot. "Buried in the storm. You had this." He nodded toward a small pile on the table. Her shawl, frozen stiff, and the small, worn Bible her mother had given her. Nothing else. The few coins she had sewn into her hem were still there, but the food was gone. "Thank you," she whispered. You saved my life." Eli Cutter did not acknowledge her thanks. He picked up another log and settled it onto the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "The storm's not quit," he said, staring into the flames. "Snow's piled to the windows. You ain't leaving soon." The words hung in the air, a statement of fact that felt like a prison sentence. She was trapped here, with this silent, grim man, miles from anywhere, with a secret life growing inside her. As she drifted back into a weak, fitful sleep, the warmth of the cabin faded, replaced by the memory of cold, polished luxury. She was back in Silas Croft's parlor in Virginia City. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of expensive brandy. Silas was a man of 50, his wealth new and his manners coarse. He owned the bank, the hotel, and her father had hoped. Soon he would own her. The memory was sharp. Silas, his face flushed with drink, grabbing her wrist, his thumb pressing into the delicate bones. "You're a high-strung filly, Clara," He'd slurred, his other hand moving toward her waist. "But I mean to break you. Your father left you to me. Lock, stock, and barrel. A debt paid." She remembered the coldness that had settled in her heart, a cold that rivaled the Montana winter. She had been sold to this man, this abusive, powerful brute, to settle her father's gambling debts. And then, the worst secret, the one that had made her run, the pregnancy. Not Silas's child, the child of a kind, gentle boy back home, a boy who had died of fever before he even knew. The shame was hers alone to carry. She had run, not just from Silas, but from the ruin he represented. She had stolen one of his horses and ridden east, toward the territories, hoping to disappear. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering. The cabin was dark, save for the orange glow of the embers in the hearth. The man, Eli, was asleep in a chair near the fire, a rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He was covered by a single blanket, his breathing deep and even. He was a man who lived on the edge of violence. Clara could see it as her strength returned over the next few days. She watched him. She saw the map of his past, written on his body. One morning, he stripped to the waist to wash, using snow melted in a basin. The firelight caught the skin of his back and chest. It was covered in scars, old, puckered wounds. One, a long, jagged line, ran from his collarbone down his chest, disappearing beneath his trousers. It looked like a knife wound. Others were small, round, the mark of bullets. He was a man who had been hunted. His world was this cabin, and she was an unwelcome guest. On the rough-hewn mantel, above the fire, sat a single object that was not purely practical. It was a small, tin-type photograph in a tarnished frame. It showed a young man, barely a boy, with wide eyes and a shy smile. He looked nothing like Eli. He looked soft, hopeful. Sometimes, Eli would stand and look at that picture. His face would grow even darker, his hands clenching into fists. Tucked beside the frame was a letter. The paper yellowed and creased. She saw him pick it up once, his fingers tracing the faded ink. He opened it, read it, and his whole body went rigid. He moved to throw it into the fire, his hand hovering over the flames, but he couldn't. With a low growl of frustration, he folded it and thrust it back onto the mantel. He was a man nursing a deep, unhealed wound. He avoided towns. He avoided neighbors. She learned this from the way he managed his supplies. He had everything: sacks of flour, beans, smoked venison hanging from the rafters, traps, ammunition. He was prepared to be alone for a very long time. The snow did not stop. It piled higher, blocking the one small window, casting the cabin in a perpetual twilight. The world outside was a howling white emptiness. They were trapped, two strangers in a box of logs. Their days fell into a silent, tense routine. He would rise before dawn, brave the storm to check on old Saul in the lean-to and chop wood. He would return, covered in snow, and spend the day oiling his traps, sharpening his knives, or tanning the pelts that hung from the walls. They ate their meals in almost total silence. The only sounds were the scrape of their spoons against the wooden bowls, the crackle of the fire, and the constant shriek of the wind. He was not a cruel host, but he was not a kind one. He provided food, a thin, hot stew, and he kept the fire blazing, but he offered no conversation, no comfort. Clara, desperate to feel useful, to not just be a mouth to feed, offered to help. "I can cook," she said one morning, her voice sounding loud in the quiet. He glanced at her from where he was lacing a snowshoe. "I do my own cooking." "Please," she insisted, her pride stinging. "I can't just sit here." He looked at her for a long time, his gray eyes assessing. He seemed to be weighing the trouble of her help against the trouble of her presence. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Potatoes in the bin." He grunted. "Peel 'em." It was a start. From then on, she took over the small tasks. She peeled potatoes and wild carrots. She mended his torn shirts, her fingers still clumsy and stiff from the frostbite. But her stitches were small and neat. She kept the cabin tidy, sweeping the dirt floor with a broom made of twigs. He allowed it, but he never thanked her. He would watch her sometimes. a look of profound suspicion on his face, as if her small acts of domesticity were a kind of trick he couldn't figure out. The tension was thick as molasses. They were always aware of each other. The cabin was too small. When he passed her to get to the woodpile, his arm would brush her shoulder, and she would flinch. He never spoke of her past, and she never asked about his. He asked no questions. When she woke from nightmares, her body rigid with fear, calling out for a name she would not say, he would already be awake, sitting in his chair, the rifle across his lap. He would just watch her until her breathing evened out. "It's just the storm," he'd say, his voice low. "Go back to sleep." He would leave broth by her cot, but he would not ask what ghosts chased her through the dark. One afternoon, the silence was broken. Clara was mending one of her own stockings, her hands finally starting to feel nimble again. The light from the window was a dull gray. She thought of her mother, of the life she had lost, and the terrifying, unknown future of the child inside her. She felt so utterly alone, a piece of driftwood washed up in a hostile land. A tear escaped, rolling hot down her cheek. She wiped it away, angry at her weakness. But another followed, and then another. A quiet, hopeless sob escaped her. She bent her head, hiding her face, her shoulders shaking. Across the room, the steady scrape of Eli's knife as he carved a piece of wood suddenly stopped. The silence that fell was heavier than before. It was loud, awful. She could feel his eyes on her. She waited for him to speak, to tell her to stop, to leave the room. He did neither. She risked a glance up through her tears. He was just sitting there, on his stool, the half-finished axe handle in one hand, the knife in the other. He was watching her, his face a mask of stone. He looked lost, uncomfortable, and angry, but he did not move. He did not speak. He just sat, a silent witness to her grief. For 1 minute, then 2, then 5. The sheer, awkward tension of it finally stemmed her tears. She wiped her face on her sleeve and took a shaky breath. Bending back to her sewing, the sound of his knife on the wood started up again, slow and steady. He had offered no comfort, but he had not left. That evening, she finished mending his last pair of winter gloves. The leather was stiff, and the work had been hard, but the seams were strong. He came in from the lean-to, shaking snow from his coat. She held them out to him. "I finished these." He took them, his large, calloused hand brushing hers. He inspected the stitches, turning the glove over in the firelight. He nodded once. "It'll hold." He started to turn away. "Mr. Cutter," she said, her voice small. He paused. I wanted to thank you." He said nothing, just looked at her. "You didn't have to stop for me. You saved my life, and my baby's." It was the first time she had spoken of it. The word hung in the air between them. He just stared at her, his face grim. "Thank you," she said again. And before she could stop herself, she reached out and laid her hand on his forearm. It was a small, impulsive gesture. His skin was rough, his muscles hard as iron beneath the flannel. She felt the heat of him, the solid, living reality of him. Eli flinched as if she had struck him with a hot poker. He yanked his arm back, his whole body recoiling. His eyes, which had been gray and cold, now flashed with something dark and hot. Anger, or perhaps fear. He didn't say a word. He turned, grabbed his heavy coat, and yanked open the cabin door. "The wind's high," she whispered, alarmed. "Stay inside," he growled, and stepped out into the blizzard, slamming the door shut behind him. Clara was left alone in the sudden, echoing silence. She stood by the fire, her hand tingling where she had touched him. She had breached the wall he had built, and he had fled. Eli returned hours later, a ghost covered in ice, his face raw from the wind. He carried a fresh load of wood and said nothing about his exit. He just kicked the snow from his boots and returned to his seat, picking up the axe handle as if he had never left. Clara, her heart still beating a nervous rhythm, said nothing. The wall between them was back up, higher and thicker than before. But the storm, in its white and howling cruelty, did not care for their silence. It raged for another 4 days, then 5, then 7. The world shrank until it was only the 4 log walls, the glowing stove, and the constant shriek of the wind. The snow piled up past the window, plunging the cabin into a dim, gray twilight even at midday. They were buried. This forced proximity changed things in ways neither of them desired. It created a need for practical, shared survival. Eli could not, in good conscience, let her remain ignorant. She was a liability. If he were to fall, to twist an ankle checking his traps or be gored by a desperate animal, she would die. She would freeze or starve, incapable of even keeping the fire alive. This, more than any thaw in his heart, prompted him to speak. "You'll learn the stove," he announced one morning, his voice abrupt. He took her to the big, black cast-iron beast that dominated the cabin. He showed her how to bank the embers at night with ash, a precise layering that kept a core of heat alive until morning. He made her do it, his large, rough hand correcting her smaller, paler one when she used the shovel wrong. "Not like that," he growled. "You'll smother it, gently. You're tucking it in for the night, not burying it." He taught her how to feed it, the difference between the fast, hot burn of pine and the slow, steady heat of the oak he kept for the coldest nights. He taught her how to melt snow for water, a task more dangerous than it seemed. "You don't put snow in a dry pot," he said, his voice flat. He pointed to the cast-iron kettle. "You leave a base of water. Always. You put snow in a dry, hot pot, it'll crack. Then we got no water. You understand?" Clara nodded, her face serious. She understood. She learned to boil the water, to skim the pine needles and bits of grit from the top. She learned where he kept the salt, the beans, the dried venison. He was giving her the keys to his small kingdom, not out of generosity, but necessity. With these tasks, her strength returned. The frostbite on her hands and feet receded, leaving the new skin pink and tender, but whole. The weakness from her long trek faded. She could carry the wood bucket herself. She could stir the thick stew without her arms trembling. But as her body healed, her spirit remained fragile. The long, silent hours, trapped by the wailing wind, gave her too much time to think. The nightmares worsened. One night, the silence stretched thin between them. They were eating stew. Clara had made it, and it was good. She had found a small cloth bag of dried herbs, thyme and sage, and had added them. The flavor was a small comfort, a reminder of a civilized world. She set her spoon down, her bowl half full. Eli didn't look up, but his chewing slowed. "I used to think," Clara said, her voice quiet, barely audible over the fire, "that I would never meet a kind person again. I thought the world was emptied of it." She was speaking to the table, to the fire, not to him. "I believed that people were only levers, things to be used to get what they wanted, that you were either the user or the one being used." She touched the rough wood of the table. "I suppose I still believe it, mostly." Eli stopped eating. He did not look at her. He stared down at his bowl, his big shoulders hunched. He said nothing. The only sound was the fire popping. Clara felt a flush of shame, of having said too much, of having exposed her broken places to this hard, indifferent man. She picked up her spoon, but her appetite was gone. "He'll heal," Eli said. The words were so sudden, so unexpected, she wasn't sure she had heard him right. "What?" He still didn't look at her. He was staring at her hands, which were now clasped on the table. "The skin." "Where the cold got it, it'll heal, but it'll always be weaker. You'll have to favor it in winter." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping on the dirt floor. He picked up her bowl and his, and moved to the wash basin. He stood with his back to her. Clara watched him, her heart aching with a strange, unnameable emotion. He would not offer comfort, but he had offered a fact, a hard, practical piece of truth. It was his only way. As he set the bowls down in the basin, she saw his hands. They were trembling, just slightly, a fine, taut vibration in the fingers, as if he were holding on to something with all his strength. He gripped the edge of the basin until the shaking stopped. Then he began to wash. Clara learned to guard her own vulnerabilities, but she could not guard the one that grew inside her. It was a part of her, this secret life. She would find herself, in the dim light of the cabin, with her hand resting on the swell of her belly. It was an unconscious gesture of protection, of comfort. Sometimes she would whisper to it, "We're safe for now, little one," she would murmur, standing near the heat of the stove. "He's a hard man, but he's not cruel. We're warm. We're safe." One afternoon, she was doing this, her back to the room, her hand moving in a slow circle over her dress. She thought she was alone. Eli had gone to the lean-to to check on Saul, but he had returned, silent as the snow. He stood in the doorway, the cold air rolling in around him. He watched her for a full minute, his face completely unreadable. There was no softness in it, no pity, but there was a deep, unsettling stillness. He was watching her the way he watched a deer on a ridge, trying to understand its nature before deciding his next move. Clara turned, sensing the cold, and saw him. She froze, her hand still on her stomach. Shame and defiance warred on her face. She was caught in her most private, vulnerable act. Eli's expression did not change. His gray eyes held hers. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a fact he already knew. Then he stepped inside, closing the door heavily, and went to his corner to oil a trap. The moment was over. He had seen her secret, and he had not spoken of it. The memory of why she had run, why this secret was so desperate, was never far. It came to her in the long nights, in the moments before sleep. She was back in Virginia City, in Silas Croft's gaudy, oversized house. Her father, his face sagging with drink and failure, had left her there. "You'll be a good girl, Clara," he had said, not meeting her eyes. "Mr. Croft is a very important man. You'll do what he says." The debt was for $5,000, a staggering sum. She was the collateral. Silas had made that clear. He was a thick-bodied man, with soft hands and wet, assessing eyes. He had bought her, and he took pleasure in reminding her of it. "Your father was a fool," he'd said one night, swirling brandy in a glass. But he had one fine thing to his name: you. He had tried to kiss her, and she had turned her head. His smell of stale cigars and bay rum had turned her stomach. His grip had tightened on her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. "I own you, girl. Don't you forget it. You'll learn to be sweet on me, or you'll learn to pretend." The final night. She had been hiding her condition for weeks. Her morning sickness a misery she had to disguise as a stomach ailment. He had come to her room. He was drunk, his face flushed. He had pulled her to him, his mouth sloppy and urgent. She had pushed him away, her panic rising. "No," she had said, her voice shaking. "Please, Silas, not tonight." "Not tonight," he had roared. His pride stung. "I say when, I say how." He had grabbed her, and she had fought, truly fought, scratching at his face. His answer had been swift. He had struck her, a hard, open-handed blow across the face that sent her sprawling to the floor. Her head had cracked against the bedpost. She had lain there, stunned, the taste of blood in her mouth. He had stood over her, breathing hard. "You're a wildcat," he'd panted. "Fine, I like a wildcat." But as he'd reached for her, the door had opened. His housekeeper, Mrs. Beale, had stood there, her face pale. "Sir," she'd said, "the men from the assay office are here, about the stamp mill." The interruption had saved her. Silas had cursed, straightened his waistcoat, and left, growling. "We'll finish this later." Clara had not waited. As soon as he was gone, she had fled. She took nothing but the clothes she wore, her mother's Bible, and a horse from his stable. She had ridden into the night with no plan, no destination, only to run. She knew his men would follow. A man like Silas Croft did not tolerate being defied. He did not tolerate his property being stolen. And she was his property, She could trust no one. Eli, too, was a man who trusted no one. His story came out in pieces, chipped away by the long, forced intimacy of the storm. Clara had finally dared to ask about the photograph on the mantel. Was he your son? Eli, who was cleaning his rifle, went still. No, he looks like a good person, she'd offered, timidly. Eli had carefully set a rag down. He'd stood and picked up the tintype. He stared at it, his thumb tracing the metal frame. He was my brother, he said, his voice flat. Micah. He'd paused, and Clara had thought that was all, but he kept talking, his voice low, aimed at the picture. Not at her. He was soft, not made for this country, liked books, liked to draw flowers. Can you imagine? A man in this territory, drawing flowers. A small, bitter sound came from his throat. It was not a laugh. This land, he'd continued, it's for grazing, but the cattle barons, they think they own it all. They think God gave them every blade of grass, and if you got a few head of your own, you're a thief. He'd put the picture down. His hand clenched. We had a small herd, 50 head. RPA left 'em to us. We had a claim on the Sweetwater. Good water, good grass. Croft's men wanted it. Clara's blood ran cold. Croft? Silas Croft, Eli said. He runs that valley, runs everything. His men came, told us to move. What did you do? I told him to go to hell, Eli said, his voice a low growl. I was quick to fight. In those days, I wasn't afraid of him. He turned, his eyes finding hers, and they were filled with a bleak, ancient grief. But Micah was afraid. He wanted to leave, just take what we could and go north. Eli had looked away, back to the fire. I wouldn't. I told him we stand our ground, that they were cowards. I taught him to shoot. I put a rifle in his hands, and I told him to fight like a man. The silence in the cabin was absolute. I rode to town for supplies. I was gone 2 days. When I came back, they had been 10 of 'em. They'd burned the cabin. They'd shot the herd. And Micah. Eli's voice broke. Just once, a raw crack. They'd shot him, left him in the yard. For me to find, he was 17. He had turned to Clara then, his face a mask of such profound self-loathing that she had to look away. He wanted to run, and I made him stay. I put the gun in his hand. It was me who killed him, same as if I'd pulled the trigger. He'd grabbed his coat and gone out into the storm, not returning until long after dark. Clara finally understood. He wasn't just hiding from the world. He was hiding from Silas Croft. He was hiding from the man he had been. He was in a prison of his own making, and the boy in the photograph was his jailer. The true thaw began with a fever. One night, Clara woke up, her teeth chattering so violently she thought they would break. A cold, deeper than the storm, had settled into her bones. By morning, she was delirious. Eli found her tangled in the furs, her skin burning hot to the touch, her body racked with violent shivers. No, she was muttering, her eyes wide and unseeing. Don't let him. Silas, no. Panic seized Eli. This was not a frostbit hand. This was not a problem he could solve with a knife or a trap. This was a sickness, an enemy inside the walls. For a day and a night, he fought it. He kept the fire roaring until the cabin was a sweat lodge. He forced hot broth and willow bark tea between her chattering teeth. He piled every blanket, every pelt he owned onto her cot. It did no good. The fever raged, but the chills worsened. Her body was consuming itself, and she was shrinking before his eyes, growing smaller, more fragile. The life inside her was in peril. Late on the second night, she went limp. Her shivers subsided into a weak, shallow trembling. Her skin was clammy, her lips turning a faint, bluish gray. Eli stood over her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was losing. He was watching another person die, and it was his fault. He had brought her here. He looked at the fire, at the trembling woman, and at the narrow cot. He was a man who had not touched another human being in kindness in 5 years. But he was also a man who had held his dying brother, trying to force his own life into the boy's cold body. He knew what to do. He hesitated, his jaw working. It felt like a violation, a trespass. But the alternative was her death. With a curse, he kicked off his boots. He stripped off his heavy flannel shirt, leaving himself in his long-sleeved woolens. He pulled back the mountain of furs, and the cold air hit her. She moaned, a sound like a lost animal. He slid into the narrow cot beside her, his large frame barely fitting. He pulled her back against his chest. She was so cold. Her skin was like ice. He wrapped his arms around her, caging her, pulling her small, shivering body tight against his. He drew the furs up, cocooning them both in the dark, musky warmth. It was not lust. It was a desperate, protective, animal urgency. It was the last, most primitive solution, his life, his heat, against the cold. Clara, in her delirium, registered the contact. She moaned and tried to pull away, her hands pushing weakly at his chest. "Easy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Easy. It's just me. Be still. I'm not him. You're safe. You're just cold." He held her, his arms locked around her. She was so thin, save for the hard, round swell of her belly, which was pressed against his own. He could feel the faint, desperate life inside. He was holding two people. Slowly, her body registered the heat. Her shivering did not stop, but it lessened. She turned in his arms, her instincts seeking the warmth. She burrowed against him, her face pressing into the wool of his shirt, her cold hands clutching his arm. She clung to him like a drowning person to a log. Eli did not sleep. He lay rigid in the dark, holding the sick woman, feeling her breath, shallow and fast, against his chest. He listened to the wind, his rifle on the floor within easy reach. He held her, and he waited. He felt the exact moment, just before dawn, when the trembling finally subsided. He felt the fever break, the dry, burning heat giving way to a drenching sweat. Her breathing deepened, her body finally relaxing against his. She was asleep. He stayed there, unmoving, until the gray light filled the window. Clara woke to warmth, a deep, enveloping, breathing warmth. She was not in her own cot, not alone. She was pressed against a solid, living thing. She opened her eyes. Her vision was blurry. Her head ached, but the terrible, bone-shaking cold was gone. She was lying on her side, her head pillowed on a man's arm. Another arm was draped possessively over her waist, his hand resting just above her belly. She was tangled in wool and buckskin, her face pressed against a chest that rose and fell with a slow, steady rhythm. Eli. She went utterly still. The memory of the fever was a dark, confusing fog, but this was real. She could feel the wiry hairs of his beard against her forehead. She could smell him, wood smoke, pine, and the faint, clean scent of lye soap. He was awake. His eyes were open, staring at the log wall just above her head. He was as still as she was. She should have been terrified. She should have screamed, scrambled away. She was in the bed of a strange, scarred recluse who had trapped her here. But she was not afraid. She felt anchored. The night's terror had been banished by this solid, vital heat. He had held her. He had kept her alive. She let out a small breath. His arm tightened for a second, then relaxed. Slowly, he released her. He moved with a stiff reluctance, as if his muscles ached. He slid out of the cot, his back to her. He stood in the middle of the room, broad-shouldered, his suspenders hanging loose. He ran a hand through his tangled hair, and for a moment, he just stood there, breathing. "The fever's broke," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. He did not turn. "You," Clara whispered, her voice raw. "You stayed." He grabbed his flannel shirt and pulled it on, his movements stiff. "You were freezing. It was the only way." He turned to face her, and the distance was back in his eyes, the hard mask back in place. But something was broken. Something had been irrevocably changed. The way he looked at her was different. He was no longer looking at a burden. He was looking at something he had fought for, something he had held. And Clara, weak and clear-headed for the first time in days, saw it. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the dark circles under his eyes. She saw the conflict, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. He had saved her, and he did not know what to do about it. Later that week, the storm finally, truly broke. After nearly 3 weeks of ceaseless wind and snow, the world outside went quiet. And then, a miracle. The sun, a single brilliant shaft of golden light, pierced the gloom of the cabin, striking the far wall where Clara stood. The snow had melted just enough from the window to let it in. She was bathed in it, the dust motes dancing around her like tiny fairies. She had her back to the room, her hand brushing through her long, unkempt hair. The light turned it from a dull brown to a cascade of fire. Her other hand rested on her belly, a simple, unconscious gesture of grace. She looked, for that 1 second, not like a desperate, ruined refugee. She looked like a painting, a Madonna of the wilderness, radiant and alive. Eli was by the door, pulling on his boots, ready to check his traps for the first time in a week. He saw her, and he stopped breathing. His breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful intake of air. He stood frozen, one boot half on, staring at her. All the hardness in him, the grief, the self-loathing, wavered. He saw not a problem, not a mouth to feed, not a woman who had brought the world to his door. He saw life. He saw a terrible, aching beauty that he had forgotten existed. He felt a pull, a deep, resonant ache in his chest that had nothing to do with lust and everything to do with a profound, terrifying loneliness he hadn't known he possessed. Clara, sensing the light had changed, turned, a small, hopeful smile on her face. Before she could see him, before she could see the raw, unguarded hunger and tenderness on his face, Eli turned away. He yanked his boot on with a savage tug and grabbed his rifle. He slammed the door behind him, leaving her alone in the golden light. The sun changed everything. It did not just bring light, it brought noise. The world, which had been muffled under 10 feet of snow, began to speak. First came the dripping, a constant, hollow percussion from the eaves. Then came the soft sighs and groans of the snowpack as it settled, and the distant, gathering rush of water finding its way downhill. The spring melt had begun. It was a slow, messy, and treacherous process. The snow did not vanish in a clean sheet. It became heavy, wet, and unstable. Eli, his face set in grim concentration, spent his days on the roof, shoveling the immense weight of the snow away before it could crack the ridge pole. He dug trenches around the cabin's foundation to channel the water, his breath pluming in the air that was still cold, but no longer killing. Clara, wrapped in one of his oversized coats, was finally allowed outside. The air was a shock, so bright it hurt her eyes, so fresh it felt like a new substance in her lungs. She was weak, her legs unsteady on the slick, thawing ground. Her first task was simple, to bring in small armloads of wood from the pile Eli was creating, stacking them near the door to dry. They tended to old Saul, the mule, who had survived the long burial in his lean-to with a stoic indifference. Clara would bring him handfuls of the precious dried oats Eli had stored, stroking the mule's coarse, cold muzzle. They made repairs. The storm had been a brute. It had loosened chinking, and Eli set Clara to mixing mud and dried grass, which she would hand to him as he stood on a stump, patching the gaps in the logs. Her hands, still tender from the frostbite, were caked in mud. She did not mind. She was working. She was alive. And with the work came a change in her. One afternoon, while she was vigorously scrubbing the stew pot with a handful of rough grass and sand, a sound filled the cabin. It was small, at first, a low, quiet humming. Eli, who was repairing a trap by the fire, went still. His hands, usually so certain, fumbled with the steel spring. He looked over at her. She was bent to her task, her face flushed with effort. A stray piece of hair stuck to her cheek. She was humming a tune, a simple, nameless melody. like one a person might use to soothe a child. It was the first human sound in this cabin, besides his own grim pronouncements and her pained whispers, that was not born of necessity or fear. It was a sound of contentment. It was life, pushing up through the snow, as insistent and fragile as the first green shoots of bear grass. It filled the silence he had so carefully cultivated. It filled the space that, for 5 years, had held nothing but the ghosts of his past and the wind's cry. He found it unbearable, and yet he found he did not want it to stop. He bent his head back to his work, his jaw tight, and let the small sound wash over him. From that day on, Clara hummed. She hummed as she swept, as she kneaded the dense, heavy dough for their bread, as she mended. The cabin, which had been a fortress of his grief, was, inch by inch, becoming a home. He began to change, too, though he would have denied it to his last breath. His gestures remained small, almost invisible. He would return from his trap lines, now a treacherous journey across slush and thawing streams, and silently place things on the table. One evening, it was a handful of early spring berries, tart and red, dug from a south-facing slope where the snow had melted first. He set them down in a wooden bowl and said nothing. Clara, seeing them, let out a small gasp of delight. The taste of fresh fruit exploded in her mouth, a sharp, bright flavor after months of salt and game. She looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude, but he was already busy with his rifle, his back to her. A few days later, a spoon appeared by her bowl. He had carved it. It was not the rough, functional utensil he used. This one was smooth, the handle shaped to a woman's smaller hand, the bowl deep. He had spent hours on it, in the dark, after she was asleep. He never mentioned it. She used it for every meal. The spring melt accelerated. The world was a mess of mud and roaring water. The small creek near the cabin had become a raging, brown torrent. Clara, feeling stronger, more restless, began to explore. She did not go far, never out of sight of the cabin's smoke. She wore a pair of Eli's old boots, stuffed with rags to fit. One afternoon, she walked past the lean-to, up the slight rise behind the cabin. The snow was thinner here, and the pines were thick, and there, in a small clearing, she found it. It was a grave, a simple mound of stones, piled high to keep the coyotes from digging. At its head was a crude wooden cross, the wood grayed and weathered. Carved into the horizontal beam, in rough, deep letters, was a single word, Micah. Clara stopped. The air grew still. This was it. This was the center of the cabin, the center of the man who lived there. This was the boy from the photograph. This was the ghost. She stood for a long time, just looking at the silent mound. She thought of his face, the soft, hopeful smile in the tintype. She thought of Eli's voice, raw with a self-hatred that had not cooled in 5 years. I put the gun in his hand. A profound, aching sadness filled her, not just for the dead boy, but for the man who was still chained to him. She stepped forward, her muddy boots sinking into the soft earth. She knelt by the grave, her hand resting on her own belly. She did not pray. She just knelt, offering a silent communion. One life lost, one life waiting. She heard the snap of a twig behind her. She did not jump. She knew who it was. Eli stood at the edge of the clearing, a dead rabbit in one hand, his rifle in the other. His face was a thundercloud. She had found his most secret, rawest place. He looked like a wolf whose den had been breached. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low growl. Clara did not stand. She looked up at him, her gaze steady, unafraid. "I'm sorry, I was just walking." He stared at the grave, then at her kneeling beside it, her hand on her stomach. The anger in his face warred with something else, something confused and pained. He saw her, this pregnant, unwed woman, paying respects to the brother he had failed. He took a step into the clearing, then another. He stopped beside her, looming over her. The silence stretched. "He would have liked you," Eli said, his voice so quiet she barely heard it. Clara looked up, surprised. Micah, he clarified, his voice rough. He liked gentle things. He would have liked your humming. He looked away, as if the admission had cost him something vital. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, leaving her there with his brother. That night, the tension in the cabin was different. It was no longer a taut wire of suspicion. It was a vibrating, humming thing, charged with unspoken words. They ate in their usual silence, but Clara kept looking at him. He had shared something. He had opened the door, just a crack, and shown her the wound inside. After the meal, she did not retreat to her cot. He sat on his stool by the fire, oiling a bridle. She took the small three-legged stool, the one he had built for her, and sat near him. Not close, just near. The fire popped. The wind had died down. The only sound was the rub of the oiled rag on the leather. "It must be hard," Clara said, her voice soft, "being so alone, for so long." Eli's hand stilled. "I ain't alone. I got my work. That's not what I mean." She paused, gathering her courage. "That day, when you held me, when I had the fever, you said my name." He looked up, his eyes wary. "I did? Yes, you told me. Clara, be still. You're safe." "You said it over and over. You sounded, I don't know, you sounded like you knew how to be kind." Eli looked down at his hands, at the dark grease, the scars, the thick calluses. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know how to be kind anymore," he admitted, his voice a low rasp. "I knew once, before, that part of me, it's broke, or it's buried. It died with the boy in the ground." It was the most honest thing he had ever said. It was a confession of a man who believed he was beyond repair. Clara watched him, her heart aching. She saw the set of his shoulders, the deep lines etched around his eyes. She saw a man who had chosen to be a monster because he couldn't bear the pain of being a man. She moved from her stool, kneeling on the hearthstones beside him. He flinched, pulling back slightly, like a wild animal that expects a blow. "You're wrong," she whispered. She reached out, slowly, so he could see her intention. She laid her hand flat on his chest, right over his heart. The wool of his shirt was coarse, but beneath it, she felt the solid, steady, powerful beat of his life. "You already are," she said. Eli stopped breathing. He looked down at her hand, so small and pale against his chest, and then up at her face. Her eyes were not filled with pity. They were filled with a fierce, steady belief. She was not afraid of him. She saw through the scars, the beard, the silence, and she saw something he thought was long dead. He felt the warmth of her hand through his shirt. It was a jolt, more powerful than whiskey. It went straight through his ribs and seized the cold, tight muscle of his heart. The air grew thick. He could smell the lye soap in her hair, the faint scent of wood smoke on her skin. He saw the soft curve of her mouth, the exhaustion that still lived behind her eyes. He was starving, and he had not known it. His hand, the one that wasn't holding the bridle, came up. It was trembling, just as it had in the kitchen. He raised it, slowly, and cupped her face. His thumb, rough as bark, brushed against the soft skin of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. She welcomed him. This simple act of acceptance shattered his control. He saw the woman in the golden light. He saw the woman who had wept by his fire. He saw the woman who had knelt at his brother's grave. He leaned in. He was going to kiss her. He could think of nothing else. His mouth was an inch from hers. He could feel her breath. And then he saw Micah's face. He saw the blood in the snow. He saw Silas Croft's men. He saw the violence, the death, the ruin he carried with him. What right did he have to touch something like this? What right did he have to pull her into his darkness? He was a killer. He was a ghost. He recoiled, pulling his hand back as if her skin had burned him. He stood up so fast his stool clattered to the floor. Guilt and shame washed over him. cold and terrible. "I can't," he breathed, his voice ragged. "I can't." Clara's eyes opened. She looked wounded, confused. "Eli? I'm not him," he stammered, backing away, gesturing vaguely. "I'm not what you need." Clara rose to her knees, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked at this big, powerful, broken man who was terrified of a single, gentle touch. "I'm not asking you to save me," she whispered, her voice fierce. "I'm not asking you to be anything. I'm just asking you to hold me." The simple, desperate plea was worse than a demand. It was a request for a comfort he did not believe he deserved to give or to receive. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe in the same room with her. The ache in his chest, the one that had started as a low throb, was now a raging fire. It was in his chest. It was in his belly. It was in his loins. It was a desperate, primal need to connect, warring with an equally powerful need to flee. He grabbed his axe from beside the door. "Eli, it's dark," Clara said, standing, alarmed. "I need wood." He lied, his voice a choked growl. The wood box was full. He yanked the door open and fled into the cold spring night. Clara was left alone, her hands still tingling from the feel of his heartbeat. He did not stop until he was deep in the trees, in the mud and the melting snow. He found a massive, felled pine, a victim of the winter's storms, and he began to chop. He swung the axe, not with the efficient, measured blows of a woodsman, but with a blind, desperate fury. He swung it against the wood, against the memory of his brother, against the face of Silas Croft, against the intolerable tenderness that was threatening to tear him apart. The sound of the axe echoed through the dark valley, a sharp, metallic report, like gunfire. He chopped until the sweat was pouring from his body, soaking his shirt, his muscles screaming in protest. He chopped until the fire in his blood cooled to a dull, manageable ache. He chopped until he was too exhausted to feel anything at all. He returned that night with a mountain of splintered pine, his knuckles raw, his body soaked in sweat. He did not speak of his flight, and she did not speak of her plea. They fell back into their silence, but it was no longer a void. It was a space filled with the memory of his touch and the ragged sound of his retreat. The line had been drawn, and they were both painfully, electrically aware of it. Spring advanced, turning the world from white and brown to a sudden, violent green. The snow receded to the high peaks, and the valley floor became a carpet of wildflowers. Clara's pregnancy progressed with the season. The child, once a secret, was now a prominent, undeniable fact. Her body, which had been thin and angular, softened and rounded. She moved with a slower, more deliberate grace, and a weariness that settled deep in her bones. Eli watched her. He watched her rub the small of her back, his own muscles aching in a strange sympathy. He watched her pause to catch her breath after sweeping the floor. He watched, and he worked. He disappeared for 2 full days, taking old Saul and his axe. Clara was left with a loaded rifle, a stack of wood, and a cold knot of fear in her stomach. He had left her. The thought was a stone. He had faced the growing bond between them and chosen the wilderness. But on the evening of the second day, he returned. He was not empty-handed. He was hauling 2 long, perfectly curved pieces of seasoned aspen, stripped of their bark. He said nothing, just dropped them by the woodpile and went inside to eat the stew she had kept hot for him. The next day, he began to build a rocking chair. He worked outside, in the warm sun, his back to the cabin. He did not work with the furious, pained energy of his wood chopping. He worked with a slow, meticulous precision. He used his sharpest knife to whittle the joints. His hands, which she had only seen clench in anger or tremble with restraint, now moved with an artisan's care. Clara would watch him from the doorway, her hand on her belly. He was not building a chair. He was building an answer. He was building a reason to stay. When it was finished, after 3 days of carving and fitting, it was a beautiful, sturdy thing. The wood was pale and smooth as bone, The rockers were perfectly balanced. He brought it inside, his face impassive in the firelight, and set it near the hearth. He did not present it to her. He did not say, "This is for you." He just put it there. Clara walked over to it. She touched the smooth arm. She sat down, and the chair tilted back with a gentle, sighing creak. She closed her eyes. It was the first true, crafted comfort she had known in a year. She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears she would not let fall. He was already at the table, cleaning his rifle, refusing to acknowledge the gift. A week later, he started on the cradle. This, too, was a silent labor. He used pine, and the cabin filled with its sharp, clean scent. He built it small, but strong, with solid sides and a gentle curve to the rockers. When it was done, he placed it on the floor next to the rocking chair. A cradle. For a baby. Her baby. That night, she knelt and touched it, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. This silent, scarred man had looked at her, looked at the child she carried, and he had built them a place in his world. He had built them a future. Their intimacy, which had been stalled by his fear, now grew in these quiet spaces. It was an intimacy of shared tasks, of a life lived in a single small room. It was in the way he would leave a skin of fresh water for her by the cot each morning, so she would not have to bend to the bucket. It was in the way she mended his shirt, this time reinforcing the collar, her stitches no longer clumsy. He would hand her a log for the fire, his calloused fingers brushing her, and neither of them would pull away. She would serve him his stew, and their eyes would meet over the bowl, a long, quiet look that held more meaning than an hour of talk. One afternoon, old Saul, the mule, managed to get his head stuck in the empty oat sack and was backing frantically around the lean-to, braying in muffled panic. Clara, watching, let out a sudden, startled peal of laughter. It was a bright, clear sound, as surprising as the first wildflower. Eli, who was untangling the mule, froze. He looked over at her face lit with amusement. A slow, rusty, unused expression pulled at his own mouth. It was a smile. It felt foreign on his face, but it was real. He turned back to the mule, but the air between them was lighter. They had shared laughter. The ghost of Micah, for a moment, had stepped aside. But the past was not a ghost. It was a hunter. One evening, Eli sat by the fire, sharpening his skinning knife. He had been restless all day, his mood dark as a thunderhead. He had ridden out at dawn, not toward his traps, but south, toward the pass that led to the lower valleys, toward the towns. He had returned with no game, just this black mood. "I rode near town today," he said, his voice a low growl, his eyes fixed on the whetstone. Clara, who was knitting small, clumsy socks from a ball of rough wool, paused. "Town? Is it safe?" "Nowhere safe," he grunted. He stopped his work, the blade resting on the stone. I wrote a letter." Her blood went cold. "A letter? To who?" "The U.S. Marshal in Helena." He wouldn't look at her. Telling him I'd found a woman. Describing you, telling him your name." The wool fell from her hands. "Eli, no, you would turn me in?" The betrayal was a cold knife in her stomach. "After the chair, after the cradle." "I rode 3 miles with it," he continued, his voice harsh. "I thought, it's the law, it's the right thing. This ain't my fight. You brought Silas Croft's trouble to my door. So you sent it," she whispered, her voice hollow. She stood up, her hands on her belly, a trapped animal. She had to run. She had to. "No," he said. He looked up, and his eyes were tormented. "I stopped. I sat there, looking at it, and I thought about them. His men, coming here, dragging you back, to him." He stood up, his body taut. "I didn't want him to find you." He crushed the air in his fist. "I burned it," he said, his voice ragged. "I built a fire and I watched it turn to ash." He had made his choice. He had stepped in front of her. He had turned his back on the law, on the world outside, and chosen her. He was protecting her, and in doing so, He was finally, truly, declaring war on Silas Croft. Clara sank back into the chair, her legs trembling. She didn't know what to say. Thank you was too small. She watched him, this man who had built her a cradle and burned a letter. As the weeks wore on, her pregnancy became a burden. She was heavy, her back ached, and fear was her constant companion. The baby was coming. And then what? What life could she offer this child? A renegade's life in a mountain cabin, a life spent looking over her shoulder. One night, she sat in the rocking chair, her hands clasped over her belly, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. Eli, seeing her, laid his book aside. "What is it?" he asked, his voice softer than she was used to. "It's not fair," she whispered, her voice thick with despair. "This baby, he's done nothing, and he's going to be born into hiding. He'll have no name, no family. He'll grow up fatherless." The word hung in the air, a terrible, shameful admission. She was a ruined woman, and her child would bear the mark of it. Eli watched her for a long time, his face carved in shadow. He knelt in front of the rocking chair so his eyes were level with hers. He did not touch her. "He won't," Eli said. It was not a comfort. It was a vow, a solemn, binding oath, spoken into the firelit silence. "What?" she whispered, searching his face. "He won't be fatherless," Eli repeated, his voice like iron. He was not offering to be the father. He was promising to be one. He was promising protection. He was promising his name, his strength, his life. He was claiming them both. Clara's breath hitched. She saw in his eyes not pity, not lust, but a fierce, absolute commitment. He had taken his stand. The emotional dam broke 2 weeks later. It began in the middle of the night. Clara woke with a sharp, terrifying cramp that seized her belly and stole her breath. She cried out, a high, thin sound of panic. The pain was immense, a deep, tearing pressure. "Eli!" she screamed. He was out of his chair in an instant, the rifle in his hand before his eyes were fully open. "What? Who is it?" "The baby!" she gasped, clutching her stomach. It's coming. It's too soon. Eli, it's too soon." Another wave of pain hit her, and she curled into a tight ball, a low keen of terror escaping her lips. Eli's face went pale. He had faced down grizzlies, blizzards, and armed men. He had never been this terrified. He looked at her, small and writhing on the cot, and he was helpless. It ain't time," he stammered, his voice shaking. "It's a month early." "It's coming," she sobbed, her body rigid. "I can feel it. What are we going to do? Oh God, Eli, I'm scared." He saw the panic in her eyes, the raw terror. This was not labor. This was fear. The fear was bringing it on. He had to stop the fear. He remembered the fever. He remembered the cold. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough, trying to force a calm he did not feel. It's just a cramp. You're just scared. You gotta get warm. You gotta be calm." He threw log after log on the fire, his hands shaking so badly he dropped one. The cabin became oppressively hot, but Clara was still trembling, her teeth chattering, her skin clammy. The pains were coming, one after another, sharp and brutal. "It's not working," she wept, her voice frantic. "It hurts." He stood over her, his heart hammering. He was losing her. He was losing them both. He had to anchor her. He had to bring her back. He made the decision. He kicked off his boots and, in one swift movement, stripped his heavy flannel shirt off over his head. His bare chest, pale and covered in the jagged, silver scars, was exposed in the firelight. What are you doing?" she panted. "Move over," he commanded. He didn't wait for her to obey. He lifted her, his arms strong, and laid her in the middle of his own cot. He lay down beside her, pulling her back against his bare chest. "Eli, no," she protested, her body stiff with pain and shock. "Be still, Clara," he ordered, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight. His bare skin was hot, a living furnace against her back. His arm was a band of steel across her middle. His hand splayed possessively, stupidly, over her rigid stomach, as if he could hold the baby in. "This is madness," she sobbed, trying to fight the pain. "Breathe with me," he commanded. "Listen to me, not the pain. Breathe in." He took a deep, slow breath, forcing his lungs to fill, forcing his body to be calm. "Now out." She was a rigid, trembling, sobbing mess in his arms. Again, he growled. "Breathe with me, Clara. Just breathe. I got you. I'm right here. I'm not leaving. You're safe. The baby's safe. Breathe." He held her, skin to skin, his own heart pounding against her back. He poured his life, his heat, his desperate, terrified will into her. He felt the waves of pain as they hit her, her whole body clenching. He just held on tighter. "You're all right. You're all right," he murmured, his beard brushing her hair, his lips near her temple. For an hour, he held her. He did not move. He just held her and breathed, forcing his rhythm on her, forcing his calm into her. And slowly, miraculously, it worked. The cramps, which had been coming every minute, began to space out. They grew less intense. Her rigid trembling softened into a weak, exhausted quiver. The false labor, brought on by fear and exhaustion, was receding. Finally, she went limp in his arms, the last of the tension draining out of her. She was not in pain. She just broke. She turned in his arms, her face pressing into his bare chest, and she began to sob. It was not a cry of pain or fear. It was a storm of grief, of loneliness, of gratitude, of all the months of terror she had held inside. She wept for her lost home, for her dead parents, for the boy who had given her this child, and for the man who was holding her now. She clung to him, her hands fisted in his wool trousers, her tears soaking his skin. "I was so scared," she choked out. I thought I was going to lose him. I thought I was alone." Eli just held her. His own body was trembling with the aftermath of the terror. He held her small, shaking form, and the last of his walls, the last of his defenses, the fortress he had built around his dead brother's memory, crumbled to dust. He stroked her hair, his hand, for the first time, gentle. "I know," he whispered. "I know. But you hear me, Clara? You ain't alone. Not anymore." He held her head, his fingers tangled in her hair. He looked down at her tear-streaked face, her eyes closed, her mouth soft with grief. He saw her, not as a burden, not as a complication, but as the one, single, living thing that had pulled him from his grave. He tilted her chin up with his thumb. Her eyes, swollen with tears, fluttered open, searching his, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of hunger. It was not rushed or desperate. It was a kiss of absolute, reverent, and shattering relief. It was a promise sealed. He kissed her slowly, his mouth claiming hers with a tenderness that shook him to his core. It was a kiss that said, "I am here. I am yours. I will not fail you." She answered him, her lips parting under his. She kissed him back, not with passion, but with a deep, answering need, a need to be held, to be seen, to be anchored. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers. That night, they made love. It was as slow and quiet as the kiss. It was an extension of the comfort, a deepening of the promise. It was clumsy with hunger and overwhelming with care. He, who had not touched a woman in this way in so long, was afraid his rough hands would hurt her. She, who had only known the fumbling of a boy and the threat of a brute, was afraid she was too broken to be wanted. He laid her back on the cot, the firelight painting her soft, swollen body in shades of gold and rose. He looked at her, at the swell of her belly, with a reverence that made her heart ache. "You're beautiful, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick. He touched her with a trembling gentleness, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw, her throat, the curve of her shoulder. She guided his hands, her own smaller ones covering his, showing him that his touch was not a curse, that she was not afraid. It was a slow, careful discovery. Two lonely, damaged people finding solace in the dark. It was not a cure. It was a balm. It was a fierce, tender act of life in the face of so much death. After, they lay tangled in the furs, the fire burning low. The cabin was silent, the world still. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her hand over his heart, feeling its steady, slow beat. His scars were warm beneath her palm. He held her, his hand resting on the curve of her hip. "No one's ever touched me like you," he whispered into the darkness. His voice was raw, humbled. "Not ever." Clara tilted her head back, looking at his strong, scarred throat. She understood. He did not mean the act itself. He meant her hand on his heart. He meant her tears on his skin. He meant her seeing him, the man behind the ghost, and not flinching, "because no one's ever seen me," she answered, her voice soft, but sure. "Not until you." He tightened his arm around her, and for the first time in 5 years, Eli Cutter slept a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee. The sun was streaming through the window. She was alone in the cot, but the imprint of his body was still beside her. She sat up, her body aching and sore, but alive in a way she had not been before. Eli was at the hearth, his back to her, fully dressed. He was pouring coffee. The cabin was quiet, peaceful. The terror of the night was gone. He turned, a tin cup in his hand. He looked at her, and his face was different. The deep lines of grief around his eyes were softer. The grim set of his mouth was gone. He looked tired, but he looked at peace. He came and sat on the edge of the cot, holding the cup out to her. Their eyes met. He did not need to speak. It was all there. She took the cup, their fingers brushing. He did not pull away. His hand moved, his rough, warm hand, and he laid it, flat and possessive, on her stomach. He just held it there. A quiet, simple gesture. He was feeling for the life inside. Her life, his life. A small, fluttering kick answered his touch. Eli's eyes widened. A slow, wondrous smile, the one she had seen only a shadow of, spread across his face. "He's strong," he whispered. "Yes," she whispered back, her hand covering his. "He is." The peace lasted for 3 days. On the 4th day, a knock echoed through the cabin. Eli was on his feet in an instant, the peaceful man gone, the wolf back. He grabbed the rifle, motioning Clara to the corner, away from the door. "Who is it?" he called, his voice hard. "It's just me, Eli," a voice called back. "Jed Slocum. I got some pelts. Thought I'd see if you wanted to trade." Eli knew the name, a trapper from the low country, a man who talked too much. Eli eased the door open a crack, his body blocking the view inside, the rifle held low. Jed Slocum was a small, weasel-faced man, his eyes darting. "Just wondering if you, my God." He breathed. His eyes had found Clara, sitting in the rocking chair, pale and terrified, but unmistakable. Slocum's gaze flicked from her face to her swollen belly and back. His eyes widened, not just with surprise, but with a sudden, greedy calculation. "Well, now," Slocum said, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading on his face. I seen a picture of you, ma'am, in Virginia City, on a poster. A wanted notice." Eli stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. He pressed the barrel of the rifle into Slocum's chest. "You're mistaken," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now, Eli, I ain't," Slocum said, his hands raising, the smile vanishing. "That's the woman Silas Croft is looking for, $500 reward. It said, for her return, no questions asked. She's not here." Eli growled. I ain't seen nothing. Eli," Slocum stammered, his eyes on the rifle. "I swear to God, I ain't no friend of Croft's. Your business is your own. I was just leaving." "You do that," Eli said. Slocum backed away, his eyes darting from Eli's face to the closed door. "I'll be going. I won't say a word. Eli, I promise." He turned and scrambled down the path, disappearing into the trees. Eli stood there for a long time, the rifle in his hands. The sun was warm. The birds were singing. The fragile peace was shattered. He went back inside, barring the door. Clara was standing, her face ashen. He'll tell them." Eli checked the rifle's load. He went to the loose floorboard where he kept his ammunition. "Yes," he said, his voice flat and cold as stone. "He'll sell us. They'll be here. And soon." The knock was a death knell. Jed Slocum's greedy, fleeting glance had shattered the fragile peace they had built. The quiet of the cabin, which had become a sanctuary, was now a trap. Clara's first instinct, the one that had lived in her bones for a year, took over. She flew to her cot, her hands shaking, grabbing the few things she owned: her mother's Bible, the spare dress Eli had found for her, the small, lumpy socks she had knitted. "We have to run," she said, her voice a high, thin whisper of panic. "Eli, we have to go now, before he gets back. We can take the mule. We can go north, higher into the mountains. We can—" Eli did not move. He stood by the barred door, the rifle in his hand. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the cradle. His face was a mask of cold granite. The man she had first met. "Eli, did you hear me?" she cried, stuffing the socks into a rough sack. "He'll tell them. For $500. He'll lead them right here. We have to run." "No." The word was flat, absolute. It stopped her cold. "What do you mean?" "No," she whispered, turning to face him. "He knows. He'll bring Silas. They'll kill you. They'll take me. They'll take the baby. We have to run." He turned, and his eyes met hers. The coldness was gone, replaced by a fire she had never seen, a protective, possessive rage that was more terrifying and more comforting than anything she had ever known. He crossed the small room in 2 strides. He took the sack from her trembling hands and dropped it to the floor. Then he took her arms, his grip hard, forcing her to be still. "Listen to me, Clara." His voice was low, intense. "Look at me." She met his gaze, her body shaking. "Your whole life, you've been running. You ran from your PA. You ran from Croft. You ran from that town. You ran all the way up this mountain. You're done running." "But they'll—" "Let 'em come," he growled, his hands moving from her arms to cup her face, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks. "This is my land. This is my home. You," he said, his voice dropping, "are mine. The child is mine. I ain't running from Silas Croft, and you ain't running no more." He paused, his gaze unwavering. Not alone. Not ever again. She sagged against him, her fear giving way to a new, sharper terror. They were going to fight. "I don't know how," she whispered, her hands coming up to clutch his shirt. "I don't know how to fight. Eli, I only know how to run." "I'll teach you," he said. The next 3 days were a grim, agonizing rehearsal for a death they both saw coming. The domesticity they had built vanished, replaced by the cold, metallic smell of gun oil and the sharp tang of gunpowder. The rocking chair sat empty. The cradle was just a piece of wood in the corner. Eli unlocked a heavy, iron-bound chest that Clara had always assumed held traps or winter supplies. It was not traps. It was an arsenal. He was unearthing the man he had been, the one who had fought in a range war, the one who had buried his brother. He pulled out a heavy Walker Colt, its barrel nearly a foot long, and strapped it to his waist. He pulled out a Spencer repeating rifle, a relic of the war, and checked its action. Then he pulled out a third weapon. It was a lighter Winchester carbine, scarred but clean. He held it for a long moment, his thumb tracing a notch in the stock. "This was Micah's," he said, his voice flat. He held it out to her. Clara looked at it, repulsed. "Eli, I can't—" "You will," he said. His voice was not cruel, just hard. "There's no choice here. You'll stand by the chink and slot. And you'll fire when I tell you. And you won't stop firing till it's empty. Then you'll load. And you'll fire again. He took her outside, to the clearing behind the cabin, near Micah's grave. The irony was lost on neither of them. He was teaching her to kill in the shadow of the boy he had failed to teach. He put the rifle in her hands. It was heavy, heavier than she could have imagined. It felt wrong, cold and deadly. "It's two. Hold it," he commanded. "Brace it, against your shoulder. Hard, or it'll break your collarbone." He adjusted her stance, his hands on her, but there was no tenderness in the touch. It was the practical, impersonal touch of a drill sergeant. He showed her how to work the lever action, how to feed the brass cartridges into the side gate, how to sight down the barrel. "Don't think," he said, his voice low in her ear. "Don't aim. Not at this distance. Just point it at the biggest part of him and pull the trigger. Then work the lever. Pull it again. Don't stop. Don't think about his face. Don't think about his family. You think about this." And he laid his hand, flat and warm, on her belly. "You think about what they'll do to you, what they'll do to him. You pull the trigger to keep him alive." He set up a piece of scrap tin on a stump, 30 yards away. "Fire," he said. She raised the rifle, her arms trembling under the weight. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The rifle kicked back with a vicious, mule-like force, slamming into her shoulder. She cried out, stumbling back. The tin was untouched. "Again," he said, his face a mask. "It hurts," she wept, her shoulder already a geography of pain. "Good," he said. "It means you're alive. Again." She fired, and again, and again. She fired until her shoulder was a raw, purple bruise, until her ears were ringing, until the smell of sulfur and smoke was in her hair and on her skin. She learned to keep her eyes open. She learned to brace for the kick. On the 10th shot, she hit the tin. It spun off the stump with a satisfying ping. She looked at him, panting, her eyes wide. He nodded once. "Load it," he said, "and keep it close." They went back inside and they waited. The cabin became a fortress. He boarded up most of the window, leaving only a narrow slit, just wide enough for a rifle barrel. He did the same on the other 3 walls, using his tools to cut small, defensible firing ports between the logs. He moved the table, stacking it with the stools to create a barricade by the door. They sat. They did not sleep. They ate cold biscuits and jerky, their rifles across their laps. The silence was heavier than the snow had ever been. It was a silence of pure, distilled dread. Every creak of the warming logs, every rustle of the wind in the new pine needles, every hoot of a distant owl, was the sound of riders. Clara would look at the cradle, then at the rifle in her hands. She was a woman who had run so she would not have to marry a brute, and she was now preparing to kill for the man who had saved her. On the morning of the 3rd day, Eli, who had been sitting motionless for an hour, his head tilted, suddenly raised his hand. "They're here," he whispered. Clara's heart stopped. She could hear nothing. "How do you—" "Harness," he said. "Down in the creek bed. They're coming up slow. 4, maybe 5 horses." He moved to his position by the door. "Go," he said, nodding to the small firing port on the west wall. "Don't show yourself. Don't fire, not unless I'm down. You understand me? Not unless I am down." "Eli, don't go out," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Stay inside. We can fight them from here." "They'll burn us out," he said simply. "I have to talk. I have to see. Stay here." The jingle of metal and the soft thud of hooves on pine needles grew louder. They stopped, just outside the cabin, in the clearing. A voice, slick and assured, called out, "Eli Cutter, we know you're in there, and we know who you're with. Mister, Croft just wants his property. Send the girl out, and we'll let you live." Eli stood by the door, his Spencer in the crook of his arm, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. "She's not property," he called back. "She's a thief. Cutter," the voice yelled. "Stole a horse and $500 in promissory notes from Mr. Croft? He's got a warrant for her, and he's anxious to meet his son." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a hot, sick bile rising in her throat. "You're on my land," Eli called, his voice dangerously calm. "I want you to turn your animals and ride back down. There's nothing for you here." "I don't think so," the man said. Clara peeked through her slit. She could see them now, 4 men, not dirty drifters. They wore good coats, good hats. They were professionals. The one who was talking, a man with a long duster and a silver star concho on his hatband, was already dismounting. "We're taking the girl, one way or another. You can't fight all 4 of us. Cut her." "I fought more," Eli said. "And you buried your brother for it, didn't you?" the man sneered. Eli's body went rigid. Clara saw his hand tighten on the rifle. He unbarred the door and stepped outside, onto the small porch. He stood there, tall and unmoving, a mountain of a man, blocking the way. "You ain't taking her," Eli said, his voice quiet, but it carried in the clear mountain air. "This is the last time I'll tell you, get off my land." The leader, Hargrove, smiled. It was a cold, reptilian expression. "She's his. Cut her. The child is his. He means to have them both." "She's mine now," Eli said. The words were simple, spoken like a vow. "And you won't take her?" Hargrove's smile widened. "So be it." His hand moved, a blur toward the gun at his hip. But Eli was faster. He had been waiting for it. He didn't even seem to aim. He fired the Spencer from his hip. The explosion roared through the valley. The man next to Hargrove, who had been drawing his own weapon, was punched from the saddle, a dark stain spreading on his chest. Clara screamed. Hargrove and the other 2 men dove for cover, firing as they moved. The world exploded. Bullets tore into the log walls of the cabin, sending splinters of wood flying. Eli fired again, levering the Spencer, driving the men back. He took a step back, toward the door. "Clara, bar!" A shot rang out, sharp and high, from a different direction. "A 5th man, hidden in the trees!" Eli cried out, a sharp, ragged sound. He staggered, clutching his shoulder. A bright red flower bloomed on his flannel shirt. He had been shot. He shoved Clara, who had run to the door, back inside. "Get down!" he roared, and stumbled in after her, collapsing to his knees. Clara slammed the heavy door and dropped the bar, her hands slick with a sudden, cold sweat. "Eli!" she screamed. He was on the floor, trying to get up, his left arm useless, blood pouring from the wound in his shoulder. The Spencer lay beside him. "The window!" he gasped, his face pale, beaded with sweat. "The west, the man in the trees." Outside, the men were shouting, emboldened. "He's hit! He's hit! Rush the door!" Clara's world shrank. The panic was so great she thought her heart would burst. But then she saw Eli's face, contorted in pain, but his eyes were on her, trusting her. She remembered his voice. "You think about what they'll do to him. You pull the trigger." She grabbed Micah's rifle. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She ran to the small firing port they had cut, the one facing west. She shoved the barrel through the gap. She saw him, the 5th man. He was reloading, half hidden behind a large pine. She didn't think. She didn't aim. She pointed. She pointed the rifle at the shadow and pulled the trigger. The kick was just as bad as she remembered, but she didn't feel it. The explosion filled the cabin. She heard a scream, a real, high-pitched scream of agony. I hit him," she whispered, her eyes wide with a sick, terrified awe. "Again!" Eli yelled from the floor. He was trying to get his Colt free with his right hand. "Reload! Clara! Reload!" The men at the door, hearing the scream, paused. They fired a volley at the cabin. "Damn it! Tom's hit! Where is she?" Clara, her hands moving with a fumbling, desperate speed, worked the lever. She chambered another round. She fired again, blind, into the trees. "She's in the walls!" Hargrove shouted. "Back! Get Tom, and get back!" She heard the men scrambling, swearing, dragging something. She heard horses galloping, fading down the creek bed. And then, silence. The silence was worse than the noise. It was heavy, ringing. It smelled of gunpowder and blood. "Eli," Clara whispered. She turned. He was slumped against the wall. His head bowed. A pool of dark, thick blood was spreading on the dirt floor beneath him. He was not moving. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." She scrambled to his side, her knees slipping in the blood. "Eli, Eli, look at me." She touched his face. His skin was cold, clammy. He opened his eyes, his gaze clouded with pain. "They gone?" "Yes," she sobbed. "They're gone. They're gone." "Good," he breathed. "Good girl." His eyes rolled back, and he went limp. "No, Eli, don't you leave me! Don't you dare!" she screamed. He was losing blood. Fast. The entire front of his shoulder was a ruin of torn cloth and mangled flesh. She had to stop it. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice shaking. She ran to the hearth, grabbed the kettle of boiling water, and tore a clean sheet into long strips. She found the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicine. She knelt beside him, her heart hammering a rhythm of pure terror. "This is going to hurt, Eli," she whispered, her hands trembling. "This is going to hurt, but you have to stay." She cut his shirt away from the wound. It was a nightmare. The bullet had gone in high, shattering the bone. It was bleeding, a dark, pulsing, terrifying flow. She took a breath. She uncorked the whiskey. "Forgive me," she wept, and she poured the raw alcohol directly into the wound. Eli screamed. It was a sound she would never forget, a raw, animal sound of pure agony. His entire body arched off the floor, and he blacked out. "Good," she sobbed, her own tears blinding her. At least he was not conscious. She worked, her hands covered in his blood. She washed it as best she could with the scalding water, her own hands blistering. She packed the wound with the cleanest rags she had, pressing down with all her weight, trying to stop the bleeding. She bound it tight, so tight her arms ached. All night, she fought for him. He faded in and out of consciousness. He was burning with fever, his body shaking with chills. He was no longer the strong, silent protector. He was a child, weak and dying. He began to mutter, "Micah, I'm sorry, Micah. I should have run with you. I'm sorry." He was reliving his failure. He was dying in the same cabin where his brother's memory lived, and he was consumed by his guilt. Clara could not bear it. She grabbed his face, her bloody hands framing his, forcing him to look at her. His eyes were open, but he was seeing the past. "No," she said, her voice a fierce, desperate command. "It's not Micah. It's Clara. You look at me. It's Clara." His gaze slowly, painfully, focused on her. "Clara." "Yes," she choked out. "You're not leaving me. You promised." "You are not leaving me. Do you hear me? I love you." The words were torn from her. A confession she had not even known was so true until that moment. "I love you, Eli Cutter, and you are not dying here, not today." He closed his eyes, a small sigh escaping him. He was slipping away again. His breathing was shallow, his skin a deathly gray. She was terrified. She had to keep him here. She had to anchor him. She sat by his side, her hand clutching his good one, and she began to talk. She whispered stories, her voice hoarse and desperate, a lifeline of words in the dark. "Bloody cabin. You're going to get better," she whispered, her voice cracking. "And you'll finish the cradle. You have to, because the baby, he's coming soon. And we'll name him Michael. Michael Eli Cutter. After your brother, and after his father. He'll have your eyes." She talked, her voice growing hoarse. She talked about the future, the one he had promised her. I'll plant a garden," she sobbed, rocking back and forth, her hand gripping his. "By the creek. I'll plant carrots and potatoes, and flowers, for Micah's grave. You'll teach our son to hunt, and to be a good man." Like you, a kind man. You'll teach him." She talked all night. She talked as she bathed his face, as she forced sips of water between his cracked lips, as she checked the bandage, which was still seeping blood. She held his hand, and she wove a future for them, a future she prayed he would live to see. Her voice was the only thing in the world. Sometime near dawn, the fever spiked. He was burning. She bathed him, her body numb with exhaustion, her heart a cold stone of dread. He was so still. She laid her head on his chest, her ear over his heart, just to hear the faint, thready beat. She was so tired. She had fought all night, and she was losing. She wept, her tears falling on his still chest. And then, a change. The light in the cabin, which had been a dark, bloody gray, softened. It grew pale. She raised her head, her back screaming in protest. She looked at the small, narrow slit of the window. It was snowing, a soft, impossible. Late spring snow was falling, thick and quiet. It was covering the bloody tracks in the yard. It was covering the trees where the fifth man had screamed. It was muffling the world, wrapping the cabin in a shroud of pure, white silence. Eli's breathing, which had been a shallow rattle, suddenly deepened. He coughed, a wet, painful sound. His eyes opened. They were clear. He looked at her, his face a ruin, his eyes full of a pain she could not imagine. He looked at her, and then his gaze moved to the window. "Snow," he whispered. Clara broke. She laid her head on his chest and wept, not in fear, but in a desperate, shattering relief. The world was going still, and he was still with her. The late spring snow was a miracle. It fell for 2 days, a thick, heavy blanket that insulated the cabin, muffled the world, and gave them a reprieve. It bought them time. Those 2 days were a blur of blood, hot water, and whispered words. Eli did not move from the cot. He was suspended between life and death, the fever his battlefield. Clara was no longer a victim, no longer a woman running. She was a general. She was a nurse. She was a wife, in all but name. She was relentless. She spooned broth, cooled with snow, between his cracked lips. When he choked, she cleaned his face and tried again. She tore the last of her own spare linens to rebind his shoulder, which was a geography of black, purple, and an angry, weeping red. She kept the wound clean with whiskey and boiled water, her hands shaking, her stomach roiling. But she did not falter. He was weak. This man, who was a force of nature, was as weak as a newborn. He was ashamed of it. On the 3rd day, the fever broke, leaving him drenched in sweat and trembling, but lucid. He watched her as she bathed his face with a cool, wet rag. "You shouldn't," he rasped, his voice a dry scrape. He tried to lift his good hand to stop her, but could not. "You see me like this. Hush, Eli," she said, her voice soft, but with an iron authority he had never heard. "You've seen me at my worst. It's my turn to be strong. You just rest. You just heal." He had no strength to argue. He closed his eyes. When he was too weak to eat, she would sit by the cot, in the rocking chair he had built for her, and she would read. She read from her mother's Bible. She did not read the fire and brimstone. She read the Psalms. Her voice was a steady, melodic anchor in the painful, feverish fog he inhabited. When her voice grew too hoarse to read, she would sing. She sang the small, humming tunes she had brought into the cabin, this time with words. They were old songs, simple lullabies her mother had sung to her. They were songs of green valleys and safe harbors. For a week, he was her only focus. She cared for him. She slept in the rocking chair, her rifle beside her. She tended the fire. She watched the snow, which was now melting again, revealing the muddy, scarred earth, but no riders. On the 8th day, Eli sat up. He did it himself, his face gray and beaded with sweat from the effort, his bad arm cradled in a sling she had fashioned from a blanket. He looked at the cabin. It was clean. The blood was gone from the floor, scrubbed away. The barricade was down. The cradle was still in the corner. His rifle, cleaned and oiled, was leaning against the wall, next to hers. You hit him," he said. Clara, who was stirring a pot of thin stew, nodded. "I did, in the trees." "He screamed," Eli said, remembering. "Yes, they dragged him away. I don't know if he's alive." "You saved us," Eli said. He looked at his hands, the good one pale and shaking. I stepped out. It was pride. That man, Hargrove, he said, about Micah. I let my anger. I almost got you killed." "You protected me," Clara said, bringing him a bowl. "You stood for me. No one has ever done that. Now eat. You need your strength." He took the bowl, his hand unsteady. He ate. The threat was still out there. They both knew it. Hargrove had retreated, but he was not defeated. Silas Croft would not give up. They were in a pause, a truce forced by a blizzard and a well-aimed bullet. The truce broke 10 days later. It was the sound of riders again, not a few, a dozen, maybe more. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his Colt in his good hand, his face pale but set. Clara grabbed her rifle, her heart sinking. They could not fight a dozen men. "It's over," she whispered, her hand on her belly. "Not yet," Eli growled. He stood by the door, but the riders did not surround the cabin. They rode directly into the clearing and stopped. They were not hard cases. They wore blue. Eli Cutter, a man with a heavy mustache and a U.S. Marshal's star pinned to his coat, called out, "This is Marshal John Rylance. We're coming in. Do not," he added, his voice like iron, "reach for your weapon." Eli lowered the Colt. He looked at Clara. "The law." The door opened, and the marshal stepped in, his eyes taking in everything in a single, sweeping glance. He saw the wounded man in the sling. He saw the heavily pregnant woman with a rifle in her hands. He saw the cradle. He saw the bullet-scarred walls. "So," Rylance said, his voice dry, "this is the war zone. They came onto my land." "Marshal," Eli said, his voice steady. "4 of them. No, 5. They drew first." "That's one story," Rylance said, walking to the hearth. "I got another from a man named Tom Prentice, who I found in Virginia City with a shattered leg. He says you and this woman ambushed him." "He says you're harboring a thief." "She's no thief," Eli said, stepping slightly in front of Clara. The marshal turned to Clara, his gaze sharp, but not unkind. "Ma'am, I have a warrant here for your arrest, issued by Silas Croft. Says you stole a horse and $500. "I took the horse," Clara said, her voice shaking, but she held her ground. "I had to. He was going to. I never stole any money. That's a lie. Were you married to him, ma'am, legally?" "No," Clara said, her face flushing. "My father, he owed him a debt. He sold me. He struck me. I ran to save my life. And my child's." Rylance looked at her belly, then at Eli, then at the cradle. He sighed, rubbing his mustache. "We've been looking into Mr. Croft's affairs for some time. Ma'am, that warrant, it's got the stink of coercion all over it. We also spoke to a trapper, Jed Slocum. He came to us. Wanted to sell information on your whereabouts." Then he heard Tom Prentice was talking about how Hargrove's men got shot to pieces. And he got scared, changed his story, said you were living here quiet as church mice, said it looked like a family. The marshal walked to the door. "Silas Croft is a powerful man, but his power is shrinking. Folks in this territory don't take kindly to his kind of range war, and they really don't take kindly to men getting shot trying to drag a pregnant woman off a man's claimed land." He looked at Eli. "You got a reputation. Cutter, folks thought you were just a bitter recluse. Now they think you're a man who'll stand his ground. You've won some quiet respect. This land," he nodded to the grave up the hill, "is yours. The woman is yours, if she'll have you. The state of this cabin is self-defense." He tore the warrant in his hands, the paper ripping in the quiet. "Far as I'm concerned, this matter is closed. But I'd watch my back. Croft won't use the law again. He'll just use desperation." The marshal tipped his hat. "Ma'am, Mr. Cutter." And they were gone. Clara sagged against the wall, the rifle clattering to the floor. Safe. They were safe. She looked at Eli. He was watching her, his face unreadable, but the tension was gone from his shoulders. He walked to her, his one good arm coming up to wrap around her. He pulled her against his chest, his head bowing to rest in her hair. "It's done," he whispered. "Clara, it's done." The baby came 3 weeks later, in the dead of night, with the full moon of June painting the cabin silver. It was not false this time. It was a tide. Clara woke with a gasp, a low, powerful wave of pressure that took her breath. "Eli," she said, her voice calm. "It's time." He was by her side in an instant. The fear was gone. The panic was gone. He was not the terrified man of the false labor. He was the man who had held her, the man she had loved back to life. He was her husband. He built up the fire. He boiled the water. He laid out the clean cloths. He bathed her face. It was a grueling, terrible labor. It lasted all night, and all through the next day. The child was stubborn, and Clara's small body, weakened by her ordeal, struggled. She screamed. She wept. She cursed the world. She cursed God, and she cursed him. "I can't," she shrieked, her body arching in a wave of agony. "Eli, I can't do it. I'm dying." "No," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He was kneeling beside the cot, his good arm holding her, his hand gripping hers, his bad shoulder, still healing, must have been screaming in protest, but he did not move. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. You fought the snow. You fought Silas. You fought me. Now you fight for this baby. Breathe, Clara, breathe with me. I have you." He was her anchor. He held her. He spoke to her, his voice the only thing in her world of pain. He did not flinch from her screams. He did not turn from her pain. He met her, eye to eye, and he held her. And in the twilight of the second day, with a final, tearing cry that seemed to rip her soul from her body, the baby came. It was a sudden, shocking silence, a silence broken by a small, thin, furious wail. The baby was alive. Clara collapsed, sobbing, her body a hollow, trembling ruin. Eli, his own face streaked with tears, worked with a clumsy, tender speed. He cleaned the child, his large, rough hands impossibly gentle. He wrapped the baby in the softest deerskin he had. He laid the swaddled child on Clara's chest. It was a boy. He was perfect. He had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes, when they opened, were a deep, clear gray. "Oh," Clara wept, her hand stroking his tiny, wrinkled face. "Oh, Eli." Eli sat on the cot, his body shaking with a relief so profound it was almost painful. He looked at the child, this small, wailing scrap of life that had cost them both so much. He reached out one calloused finger and touched the baby's hand. The tiny fingers, perfect and new, instinctively curled around his Eli Cutter, the man who had hidden from the world, the man who had believed his life was over, choked on a sound he had not made since he was a boy. He was undone. Clara watched him, her heart so full she thought it would burst. She touched his scarred hand, which was now linked with her son's. "You're not alone anymore, Eli," she whispered, her voice raw. "Neither of us is." Spring bloomed. The world, which had been a harsh, brutal enemy, became a garden. The valley was awash in bluebells and Indian paintbrush. The air was warm, and the sound of the creek was a gentle murmur. Life began. Eli's shoulder healed, leaving a new, puckered scar to join the map of his past. But he was a different man. The ghosts were gone, replaced by the crying of his son. He built. With his strength returned, he plunged into work. He built a fence around the cabin, not a high, defensive wall, but a low, aspen rail fence. It was not to keep the world out. It was to mark their home. He planted roots. Clara, with the baby strapped to her chest in a sling she'd made, planted a garden. She tilled the rich soil by the creek and planted the seeds Eli had bought on their first trip to town. She planted carrots, beans, and potatoes. And she planted flowers, bright red and yellow, which she transplanted to the small, quiet grave behind the cabin. She stitched curtains. She used old flour sacks, and with a precious bit of red thread, she stitched a line of small, simple flowers along the hem. The cabin, once a dark fortress, was now light. The windows were open. The cradle was never still. They named the boy Michael. One evening, they stood by Micah's grave. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of purple and gold. Michael was asleep in Eli's arms. Clara had her hand on Eli's good arm, her head resting on his shoulder. "He would have loved this," Clara whispered. "He would have loved Michael." "He would have loved you," Eli said, his voice thick. He turned, his gray eyes soft in the fading light. He kissed her, a long, slow kiss of peace and promise, under the birch tree, with the graves of the past and the hope of the future surrounding them. They visited town. They had to. They needed supplies. They rode in, not as fugitives, but as a family. Eli led old Saul, who was packed with pelts to trade. Clara sat on the mule's back, Michael in her arms. She sat tall, her back straight, her face clear. She was not a ruined woman. She was a mother. Eli, his rifle slung on his back, his colt at his hip, walked beside her. He was not the wild mountain man. He was a father, his gaze quiet, but missing nothing. The town watched. Men stopped their conversations. Women paused their shopping. They watched the Cutter family walk the length of the main street. And the locals, the blacksmith, the mercantile owner, the ranchers who had once feared Eli, they nodded. It was a small, curt gesture, a gesture of respect. The past, however, was not quite finished. As they were loading old Saul with flour and salt, a man stepped out of the saloon. He was dressed in fine, Eastern clothes, but they were muddy, and his face was unshaven. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he smelled of stale whiskey. It was Silas Croft. "Clara," he breathed, his voice a desperate, broken rasp. Clara froze. Eli stepped in front of her, his hand moving to his side. "So this is it?" Croft sneered, his eyes wild. "You left me for this? A killer. A mountain savage." "She's my wife." "Croft," Eli said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get out of our way." "Your wife?" Croft laughed, a high, cracked sound. "She's my property. She's a thief, and that child." He pointed a shaking finger at Michael. "That's my child. You stole him from me." He was a man undone, his power in the territory broken by the marshal's investigation, his pride shattered. He was desperate. "He's not yours," Clara said, her voice clear and cold. "He was never yours. I was never yours." "You whore!" he screamed, and he lunged, his hand grabbing for her arm. "You're coming with me. He never finished. Eli did not draw his gun. This was not a fight. This was an execution of a different kind. Eli hit him. His good hand, a fist like a granite stone, struck Croft in the jaw. It was a single, brutal, concussive blow. Croft crumpled to the ground, his head hitting the mud of the street. Eli stood over him, panting, his body thrumming with 5 years of held-back rage. He looked down at the man who had destroyed his brother, the man who had tried to destroy his wife. He wanted to kill him. He wanted to end it. He looked at Clara. She was watching him, her face pale, but unafraid. She was holding their son. Eli relaxed his fist. He looked down at the groaning, broken man in the mud. "You lost your chance," he growled. "She chose her future." He turned his back on Silas Croft. He put his hand on Clara's arm, and without looking back, he led his family out of town, walking back up the trail, toward the high, clear air of home. The summer was long and warm. The garden grew. Michael grew. He was a strong, quiet baby, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's gentle spirit. One morning, the air was cool, a hint of autumn on the breeze. The cabin was quiet. Clara was mending one of Eli's shirts, her stitches small and even. She looked up. Eli was sitting in the rocking chair he had built. He was rocking their son, who was gurgling in his sleep, his small, fat hand fisted in Eli's beard. Eli was just watching him, his face, the hard lines softened by time and by love, full of a quiet, profound awe. Clara watched them, the man who had saved her, the child who had saved them both. A slow, quiet smile touched her lips, and tears filled her eyes. They were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a gratitude so deep it ached. This land is harsh, but so are we. And love is the only thing that ever warmed me like this. Thank you all for listening to that story. I'm always curious to know where these tales land. So please, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. If you enjoyed the journey, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to From Wild West and maybe share your thoughts. It means the world. Until next time,